the stunning thing that Jesus tells them, which they never would have expected, is this. He says, look, fellas, don't worry about looking for signs for the Messiah to come. Don't worry about looking out for particular events of the kingdom of heaven, because you've missed the boat. The kingdom isn't to come. The kingdom is already here. In fact, the more accurate translation there of verse 21, it's not the kingdom of God is within you. It actually literally reads, the kingdom of God is among you. Jesus there's some Pharisees. He says, look, the kingdom of God's here. It's me. In my coming, the kingdom has come. You've already missed it. And it's really what Jesus is doing here is actually giving the Pharisees a warning. Or really a second warning, as we'll see in a moment. To not miss the boat, to not miss what was going on before their very eyes, because some 600 years before in Isaiah had talked about the sort of things that would mark the coming of the Messiah. And say, example, in chapter 35, verses 5 and 6 of Isaiah, it says that when the Messiah comes, the lame will walk, the blind will see, the lepers will be cleansed. In chapter 61, verse 1, it says the captives will be set free. And in Luke, he's often quoting Isaiah. So in chapter 4, Jesus gets up and actually reads out that passage from Isaiah 61 and says, well, it's true in me. And then by chapter 7, of course, we get that event. Remember when John the Baptist is in prison? He's languishing there in prison, and he sends some of his disciples to Jesus to say, are you the one who is to come? Are you the Messiah, or should we expect someone else? And what was Jesus' reply? Go back and tell John, the lame walk, the blind see, the lepers are cleansed. Jesus saying, look, you've known your Old Testament, you know that the signs were about Messiah, John. They're coming true before your very eyes. And yet just a few chapters later, in chapter 12 of Luke, just flick back there for a moment, Luke chapter 12, verse 54, where again the Jewish leaders are actually rebuked by Jesus for not seeing what is right before their own eyes. In verse 54, Luke 12, and Jesus says, look, you mob, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say it's going to rain, and it does. When the south wind blows, you say it's going to be hot, and it is. Hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? We know what it's like to predict the weather. It's August. It's windy. We say it's Echo Week. It's the same thing. Jesus said, look, you can go out and predict. There's a fog. You know it's going to lift. It's going to be a bright, sunny day. So, look, you can do that on the human level, but you're not seeing what's before you. You're not picking the spiritual things. And so Jesus is now giving a second warning in chapter 17. Hey, Pharisees, you weren't listening last time. Listen this time. You're missing what is before your very eyes. Again, the Pharisees had failed to read the signs. Again, what had Jesus just done in the passage immediately before this? 10 lepers were cleansed. Remember? What are the signs of the Messiah? Lame walk, blind see, lepers are cleansed, year of the Lord's favour is proclaimed. Even right there, they still hadn't seen it. Here they were looking for future signs, looking out, and they'd missed what was before them. It's funny, I used to live near a guy who's actually a neighbour, a few doors up, a guy called Kip. English guy, middle-aged, moustache, married, one child. Quite friendly, wasn't a Christian. And yet I used to come up and we used to talk about Christian things, and we began going through a course on Christianity. But one day after work, he came and saw me, all worried. He said to this guy at work who gave him this book, and he'd been reading it. It was all about the signs of the ends of the times, and he'd been reading it and looking at the news, and he was getting all alarmed that Jesus was just about to return because of the wars and the famines. And And he got so caught up in looking at all this stuff and reading all this material that he stopped coming to church and stopped really any interest in Christian things, which is tragic. That Jesus warns us, look, don't get sidetracked by that sort of stuff. Don't get sidetracked by that rubbish. Every 30, 40 years, someone wants to claim that Jesus is going to come based on what's happening in the world. Don't listen to it. And don't get sidetracked. Don't miss out on the real thing. So friends, this passage really only has two main points. And the first one is that Jesus is saying the kingdom of God has already come. When Jesus came on earth, when he was born in that stable, the kingdom of God has already arrived. But friends, we know that there is more to the picture, don't we? And Jesus goes on to explain that there is more. Because having dealt with the Pharisees' question of when the kingdom will come and say, look, it's already come, he then turns to his disciples and uses it as an object lesson, not to talk about his first coming, but to begin talking about his second coming. Because in Jesus, though the kingdom has begun to come, it is still to come in its fullest sense. Theologically, we use a phrase that is now but not yet. It's come but not fully come. It makes it a little bit like, imagine you're there on your wedding day and you're there in the church. It's not until the end of the service, when you pronounce husband and wife, and that if things officially signed, and that you're actually married. You know the day's been coming and you're in the midst. Imagine the church service going for 2,000 years and we're still waiting to get to the end. I think there'd be a few frustrated grooms out there. That's true. And the kingdom of God, we've begun to feel the effects. Even in Jesus' day, it wasn't like he healed every leper or every blind person who was given sight. Only some were. And so God's kingdom began to break into the world. In our day and age, we still see the effects of the kingdom, the transformation of lives like Claudia. That's the kingdom of God within her working. And yet we still look out and we see the world as it is, and we know that the kingdom of God certainly hasn't come in its fullest sense. We're still waiting for Jesus to return. And so what Jesus goes on to do is actually to mention three things to his disciples about his second coming. First, in verses 22 to 25, he tells them something about the timing, about when it's going to happen. Then in verses 26 to 30, he talks about what it's going to be like. Not just when it's going to happen, but what it's going to be like. And then he moves on in the last couple of verses to talk about how they are to live right now. Firstly, when's it going to happen? Because we all want to know, don't we? Well, I know I do. When's Jesus going to come back? Because if he's coming back next week, we won't worry about studying for those exams. We won't worry about being behind in the rent or the mortgage repayments, though we will if he's not coming back for 10 years. So when will it be? Friends, read with me from verse 22. Jesus said to his disciples, the time is coming when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it. Men will tell you, there he is, or here he is. But don't go running after them, for the Son of Man in his day will be like lightning which flashes up and lights up the sky from one end to the other. But first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation.